What's the scariest, creepiest, or most disturbing thing that's ever happened in your house? I was having an intense lucid nightmare in which I became convinced that my parents were in danger and I had to contact them. Aware that I was dreaming, I was desperately trying to find a way to wake up or contact them from within my dream. I was completely distraught, convinced that they would die, when some sort of spirit guided me to this ridiculous machine through which I could call the waking world. It was a mess of levers, dials, buttons and switches, and I had to wind it up to get it to start working. I frantically pressed, wound and jabbed at the thing until suddenly it sparked into life and I could hear a crackled faint ringtone. Suddenly it went through and I heard my mother say hello before I abruptly woke up. I was lying in bed for just a few minutes calming down from the intensity of the dream before my mum called me. She asked why I had called her from the house phone and hung up just moments before. The only house phone is 3 floors away from mine. I have never sleepwalked in my life and I woke up in bed just after she received the call. When I was 10 years old, my parents bought a condemned house to be renovated by us. This would be a year-long process. When it came time to sign papers for the house, the former owner nonchalantly mentioned that her brother, that has been in prison for 10 years, is about to get out of prison. His name is Jimmy. She said he had somewhat of a split personality. One moment he was an angel, the next he had a shotgun pointed at your face. We didn't know what to expect, and as a little boy, I was a little nervous about it, and we were locked in the contract as we had already signed the papers. Months had gone by and we had been working on the house. Then all of a sudden one day, we find that the driveway was barricaded, and someone had crap on the front porch. It was Jimmy. He had put all of our construction equipment in the driveway to block us, and then pinched a loaf on our porch. We called the cops, had a restraining order put on him, and didn't really see him for a while. Now, why was he in prison? He and a friend of his got drunk one night. His friend stated that he wanted to kill himself, and then Jimmy said that he would just do it for him. So Jimmy found a stick and stabbed his friend and killed him. But it didn't end there. Then Jimmy poured wax over his friend's eyes, cut him into several pieces, and spread the body parts all over the town we lived in. He also killed someone out of self-defense in prison. We had finished renovating our house and were all moved in. Jimmy had not shown up for a while, which is what creeped me out. I shared a room with my brothers. This room was near the front porch. My mind played with me for a solid year. I barely slept, because I thought Jimmy was outside my window, just waiting to pour wax over my eyes. A couple more months go by, and Jimmy shows up one day. He wanted to come in and apologize to us for what he did to the house. My siblings and I are standing at the door, watching my dad outside talking to him. My dad said no of course, and told him to leave. That was the last time we saw Jimmy. He never really did anything to hurt us, but just the thought scared me for a long time. Additional thought. One of my goals in life is to make a Western film. I want to use Jimmy as inspiration for the story, a character in the movie. One of the more disgusting things I can think of is my GF and I had just got a puppy. He was being crate trained at night, so when we went to bed, we would place him in his crate, padded, right by our bedside so that he could see we were right there. Everything is fine except one night he had diarrhea all over his bed crate. I hear it happening, and as I'm walking over and turning the light on, I see that he is lapping it up. Horrified, I yell no, and just as I'm running over to get him out of the crate he starts vomiting said diarrhea vomit all over himself and me. It was a pretty crappy night. Funny side note, the next morning, I take him outside to the front yard so that he can do his thing. Now mind you, he'd just been ingesting poop and pooping out of both ends just hours earlier, so things were still moving around inside, if you will. Anyways, so I'm standing on the front lawn next to him waiting for him to pee, and this couple are walking by and they see him and say to me, "Oh, what a cute puppy," and then as if on command, our puppy lets out this loud belch and lifts his little tail and farts a big wet one. The looks on their faces, priceless. Ah, the classic poo bath, for when dogs want to take it up a notch. My apartment building screams. The building has 3 apartments in it, so there aren't many people around here. When you leave my apartment, there's a little stairwell hallway sort of room that just goes outside to the front of the building. My boyfriend and 2 friends of mine were standing in that hallway, and they all heard a scream, and it wasn't coming from any sort of apartment. but my friend says it sounded like it was right behind him in the hallway with him. The second time I was in my room and I had some headphones on while I was doing some homework. I thought I heard a scream downstairs, but since I had music playing I figured I was hearing things. 5 minutes later my roommate comes into my room asking if I heard it. She had been standing in the kitchen when she heard it outside in the hallway and she said it was so loud and quick but it sounded like a female. Then the other night my boyfriend and I were leaving to go out to eat and we're walking down the stairwell and halfway out the front door when we hear it right behind us, as if it was on the stairwell. At first when I heard the other two stories, I figured it was a girl in second apartment, since one apartment is full of all boys and the other has 2 girls. But it wasn't a scream from an apartment, because the sound would be sort of muffled because of the thick walls between the apartments. This scream was definitely in the stairwell with us. None of us have any explanation for it. We've walked around the stairwell trying to recreate the sound if it was creaking floorboards or a squeaky door, but nothing. The girl they have under the stairs screams whenever someone walks on her. Done. Last summer we were painting my room a new color after a good decade of the same old one. After a couple of coats we left it to dry. When we came back a few hours later, the paint was perfectly dry, except for one thick streak against one wall that was melting. The old paint color was coming back through as the new color dripped down. Inexplicably, we started joking about a ghost, but it did freak me out. Not long after, my sister and I were hanging out in the kitchen getting things to drink. She set her glass down for a moment and out of nowhere it exploded. It was as if someone shot the glass. Shards flew all over the kitchen. We were stunned. I knew a change in temperature could crack glass, but she had poured room temperature liquid into it. It had no previous cracks, and it freaking exploded. It didn't just crack. In the end, they were both explainable. Apparently glass can sometimes explode like that without any impact thanks to nickel sulfide in the glass that reacts very slowly or something. And the strip of dripping paint? It was a part of the wall where the air conditioning ran, and during this stupidly hot day of summer we had the AC blasting. So, no poltergeist. But at the time these two incidents freaked me out. Many years ago when I was about 21 I was staying at my parents' place after finishing uni and figuring out what to do with my life. During those halcyon days I often went out in the evening to party and would come back at unearthly hours, and on return would creep in as quietly as possible as my parents being very light sleepers. One fine midnight hour, I did just this having arrived at the house under the swell of a crescent moon, carefully tiptoeing up the gravel drive, gently turning the key in the lock, padding my way to the spare bedroom, and tenderly pushing the door shut, somewhat and continuing to remain in the spirit of night camouflage I kept the light off and stood behind the door and slowly started to get undressed. Having pulled my top off, I suddenly became aware in the gloom that the door behind me seemed to be opening on its own accord. Remaining calm, I stopped undressing and found myself naturally moving back behind the door as it opened mysteriously into the room. Assuming it was my mum or dad, there was no one else in the house, and being admittedly still quite as the door opened, I dutifully craned my neck around and uttered, in a slightly theatrical but friendly voice, "Hello?" Double quote. From that point onwards, all heck broke loose, for all I could hear in the darkness following my greeting was screaming and shrieking at high decibel, and the sound of crashing madness in the hallway. I quickly turned on the bedroom light and sprang into the hallway only to be met by more screams. Screams of horror, terror, sheer unmitigated madness. As I looked down the hallway I saw my mother stark naked, a somewhat rotund woman with enormous boobs, facing me transfixed with fear on her face, falling backwards into the cupboards along the hallway as she flailed her arms in terror, and only screaming louder upon my apparent presence. Her madness combined with her short-sightedness was clearly such that she could no longer recognize me, and I had in her mind become some kind of nightmarish intruder who, despite a friendly hello at 1 AM in the morning coming from her son's bedroom, was not enough to trigger some much needed familiarity. It was so strange. For a good 15 seconds I stood there saying, "Mum, it's me," only to have her go into another thunderous bout of terror and screaming. All the commotion obviously woke up my dad, and the scene ended with him emerging from the master bedroom, bleary-eyed and bewildered with dressing gown on, naked wife hyperventilating against the closet doors. and confused drunken son in boxer shorts looking at him with a sense of desperation and resolute hilarity. Scary for mum, surreal for me. I was 13. I woke up one night to the sound of children laughing outside my window. I had an 11-year-old brother who had friends next door, so I thought nothing of it. Happened a couple of nights in a row, and so I told little brother to knock it off or I'd go all big brother and nudge him or something. He gave me poker face, said he could hear them too. I figured he was just being a dork. That night I heard it again. I got up and opened the window to yell at him and his friends. All I saw out my window was the darkest, blackest silhouettes I've ever seen. There were 4 or 5 of them, about the size of a toddler. As soon as I screamed, they vanished. Dad went outside to see if he could see anything. Of course he didn't. I heard them twice since then. The first time I bailed and slept in the living room. The second time I got balls enough to look outside again. There they were. I went all 70s horror movie preacher and held up a Bible and screamed, in the name of the Father and the Son I command you to leave and never return. They never came back. I'm guessing because they were busy laughing at me somewhere else. No, it wasn't raccoons. I grew up in the sticks. I know what their creepiness sounds like. I'm an atheist, but I see crap like that I will be screaming Jesus' name up and down. This didn't happen in my house, but it happened near my house. It was by far the creepiest thing that ever happened to me, so I had to share. I was driving home from my then GF's house around midnight. It was summertime and very hot, and had rained earlier that evening, so it was kind of foggy. I had to drive down Route 17, which is a really old road that ran from where I lived to where she lived. It also passed through Burkittsville, the town where the Blair Witch Project came from. I was driving through the area that was mostly old rundown farms. The road has a lot of sharp turns in them, so you have to go slow. I was going through a turn, and through the fog I all of a sudden see an old man walking across the street. I slammed on the brakes and braced myself for the impact because I knew there was no way I was going to stop in time. I remember the old man turned and looked right at me as my car was about to plow into him. He opened his mouth and looked like he was screaming no. But as my car hit the area of where he was, it vanished. My car finally skidded and came to a stop. I wasn't sure what the heck just happened, and I didn't hear any thump on my car, so I immediately got out of my car and was looking around looking for a body. I didn't see anything. I went to the front of my car and didn't see any damage. I walked behind my car a few feet and couldn't see anything. I must have walked about 40 or 50 feet and I started getting freaked out. And then I heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the darkness. I pretty much almost crapped myself by this point and sprinted back to my car. I told my mom the story the next morning, and just telling the story gave me goosebumps. My mom, who normally doesn't believe in the paranormal, looked at my arms and said, "Just by your reaction, I believe you." To this day, I am not sure what I saw. It could have just been the fog, but it seemed so real to me. I found out later on that I was not the only person to claim to see an old man crossing the road. Troll ghost. 2 stories. I once lost my frog and went to sleep. I kept thinking I felt the frog in my bed, so I sat up and looked at my pillow. I have frog pattern pillowcases and I was tripping balls. Second story. I was lying in bed looking at the ceiling and noticed very faintly there were dots on my ceiling. I turn on the lights, and I guess there were spider eggs hatching in my ceiling light and they were all crawling out. There must have been hundreds, all coming from the same area, and the shadows the light made created really long lines for each spider, and it was freaky as frick. I was always scared of spiders as a kid and this just put it over the top. I woke up the rest of my family by vacuuming the ceiling in the middle of the night. I was always scared of spiders. I woke up the rest of my family by vacuuming the ceiling in the middle of the night. If I were your family, I'd be proud as heck that you manned up and took care of your own crap instead of crying for help. I grew up in a really rural town. It took 15 minutes driving to get to any sort of establishment. One night, I was about 8 or 9 years old. My friend and I were standing outside in the driveway waiting for my father to come outside to bring her home. All of a sudden we hear this rustling around in the bushes. Now, it would be strange for a deer to come that close to a couple of kids fooling around, but we couldn't see what it was and our first reaction was to figure it must be an animal. It was just an animal until we hear, in a deep and rough voice, "Hey!" We ran to the light of the house. screaming as we got in the door about how there was something in our bushes. My father came out to investigate. I was still shaking in my boots. Then, a drunk man comes wandering out of the bushes. He said he heard us talking, so he thought we could help him. But I'm still confused as to how he managed to get into the bushes in the first place. He was looking for a road that was about 1.5 miles away. We sent him on his way, and from then on it was easy to make me jump out of fright when I was alone in the driveway at night. When I was 16, I had an elderly neighbor who used to go off to visit her son now and then, who lived some miles away. One day in summer we remarked to another neighbor about my elderly neighbor's absence and was told that this time she hadn't actually gone at all. We hadn't seen her for 2 weeks. We tried to get her attention via the doorbell, but it was no use. Being 16 and brave, I went round the back of the houses and vaulted the garden wall. I positioned a bucket against the back window and climbed onto it. Inside I could see a wing-backed chair turned 30 degrees away from the window. I could see her long grey hair hanging down, and her left arm draped over the left armrest. I don't know what possessed me at that point, but I jumped off the bucket and opened her kitchen door, at which point that smell hit me. My legs turned to jelly. I walked through her tiny kitchen and into her lounge where I saw her sitting as I had seen her from outside, clearly dead. The smell was, dear God, unholy. She was about 10 feet away from me. I forced myself to look into her face. Her eyes were open and translucent. One appeared to have something seriously odd about it. Then, it moved. The biggest freaking spider I have ever seen had taken up residence on her vacant eyeball. I ran. You ran so far away. I used to live in a 110-year-old Victorian house in San Jose with a few buddies of mine. We'd hear stories from contractors that were preparing the house for renters after the old lady had gone senile and been transferred to a nursing home. Things like footsteps upstairs when no one was home and the electrician was in the basement, hollow noises where noises shouldn't come from, etc. Well, about 3 months after we moved in, we would be startled by apparent heavy footsteps coming up the wooden stairs from the street. Thinking it was one of our roommates coming home early, we would always open the door to greet him. There was never anyone there. I can't stress that enough. Yet, the best would come almost 1.5 years later. I was splitting the front room with my friend and late one night, probably 3:30 am if I recall correctly, I awoke to the right side of my futon depressing in upon itself and the wooden part of the futon creaking very loudly as if some extreme weight had been set on it. This was compounded by the fact that my whole left side of the futon I had been sleeping on lifted in the air by about 6 inches. Yeah, it was dead quiet and all the hairs on my body went up as the air got noticeably colder. I was sleeping toward the wall and for 2 very long minutes I tried to get myself to face whatever it was that was causing my whole freaking bed to raise up. Let me tell you this, to even get that futon to creak you would have to jump up and down on it with significant weight. Just the way it was creaking sounded like 300 pounds were being focused on one joint. Yeah, whatever it was dissipated into thin air as my bed slowly went back down again. I woke up to a freaking deep depression on my right side of the futon, something that I also can't stress enough, would take lots of weight to do, as it was a very firm futon mattress. It gets better. My roommate was awake the whole time and heard the exact same thing I did at the same time I told him it happened at. He never opened his eyes either as he thought it was just me shifting the bed around or whatever. After this, it never happened again, but I could totally tell it was something in the house finally trying to connect with us, and it took all the energy it could in the room to get the point across. Even when I see the house today, it still freaks me out. My parents had just recently purchased an old Victorian house that was conveniently located near an Indian reservation and an abandoned mental institution. Of course something bizarre was bound to happen. Anyway, I was about 8 and one day we discovered that one of the large decorative square patterns in my wall was actually a door to a small crawl space. When we opened it up, the only thing inside the room was a small kid's desk, a small chair, and a notepad of some sort on the desk, which looked empty of any writing. Maximum creepy. Needless to say we sealed that thing up tight. However, that night I woke up from a cold breeze coming from somewhere in the room and saw that the stinking crawl space door was wide friggin' open. I got up and just ran to my brother's room to sleep. That morning we went back to seal the room again and saw that the little pad of paper was opened up. We thumbed through it more accurately this time and found just 2 pages on it where it was written with pencil, "Mommy, I don't like it here. WTF. I hate ghost stories, and being a natural skeptic, I read stories like these and immediately think they are bulls, but that is just my built-in defense mechanism. That said, I never wanted to believe in the existence of such a thing until I had my own experience. An old girlfriend of mine and I went to visit some friends who had recently purchased a new home in Chicago. It was one of your typical Chicago-style bungalow homes. So the guy is showing me around the house and everything is pretty standard fare until he says, "Let's go check out the wine cellar." "You have a wine cellar? Sweet." So we go into one of the bedrooms and in the closet there is this small half-size door with locks on it to lock it in a manner so nothing that is downstairs can come up into the house. We open the door and it leads down into a full-sized basement. At first I thought it was really cool, and then I started to ask why the only way into the basement was through this weird door in the closet. My friend had no clue, but he didn't think anything of it. I recall feeling kind of strange and uncomfortable down there. Later on that evening we all went out for dinner and drinks and returned to the house to catch some sleep. They had 2 couches that my girlfriend and I were to sleep on. Now, it's not uncommon that when I am sleeping somewhere for the first time I have a difficult time falling to sleep, so I am lying there on the couch just staring at the ceiling and listening to my friends busily moving around the back of the house, or so I thought. After lying there for what seemed like a couple of hours, listening to all these back and forth footsteps and the sounds of door opening and closing, I decided to get up and go see why our friends were still awake. When I got to their bedroom door I realized that everyone was very much asleep. At first I was a bit freaked out, so I went back to my couch, pulled the blanket up to my chin and just laid there with my eyes wide open. More noises. By the time I heard the doorknob of the front door turning, which was only a few feet away from where I was lying, I literally just started laughing. I had no idea what else to do. I wasn't scared. I was just kind of blown away by how surreal it all was. Finally I drifted off to sleep. The next morning I woke up very groggy and my girlfriend was already up sitting on the couch across from me. As soon as her friend walked into the room, the first thing she said was, "Dude, your house is totally haunted." I couldn't believe it, but the whole time she was hearing the same thing as I. When we tried to talk to our friends about it at breakfast, they absolutely refused to discuss it. That was the last time we stayed there. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.